911, what's your emergency?
You've probably heard that nobody is born evil, that people are shaped by what happens to them, not by what they're born with. But these brothers are about to make you question that. These are the most notorious spree and serial killer brother duos in history. Pairs of brothers who terrorized and left entire communities permanently scarred, and families that will never fully recover. And it gets more disturbing with every single one. Let's get into it. Robert and Stephen Spahalski were born on December 12, 1955, and grew up in Elmira, a small working-class city in the southern tier of New York State. On paper, there was nothing about this family that stood out from any other working-class household in upstate New York at the time. What stood out was the twins themselves. They were identical right down to the bone structure, inseparable from the time they could walk, and they had this almost instinctive awareness of where the other one was and what he was doing at any given moment, even when they were not physically together. On top of that, both boys were genuinely gifted. They became two of the best gymnasts their school had ever produced. And here's the thing about twins who are that closely wired to each other. When one of them starts heading somewhere, the other one tends to follow. Doesn't matter if it's a good direction or a bad one. In Robert and Stephen's case, it ended up being a downright evil direction. And it started right there in Elmira, with two boys who liked to party and liked trouble. And from a very early age, trouble started liking them right back. Robert, who went by Bruce to the people who knew him, was the first to start collecting a criminal record. At 16, he was arrested for driving a stolen car. Then he was later arrested for arson and criminal trespass. By 18, he had his first burglary conviction and a prison sentence to match. And over the next 8 years, he went back twice more on the same charge. None of it slowed him down, and none of it seemed to teach him anything. And like his twin, Stephen had that same hunger for crime running through him. Except for Stephen, it was darker. He will end up being the first of the two brothers to take a human life. In January 1971, a 48-year-old store owner named Ronald Ripley was found dead in Elmira Heights. He had been attacked from behind on a stairway, struck over the head with a hammer, and then stabbed repeatedly. By this point, the Spahalski twins weren't strangers to police. The two of them had already built a reputation around Elmira Heights. Trouble, petty crime, names that came up whenever something went wrong in the neighborhood. So when Ronald Ripley turned up dead, investigators went straight to the twins. Except Robert was already sitting in Chemung County Jail on an unrelated parole violation. So it came as no surprise to them when Stephen stepped forward and confessed. He told police that Ripley had made unwanted sexual advances toward him and that he had reacted. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 12 to 25 years in prison. He was 16 years old at that time. And this is the moment their two paths split. What followed over the next 2 decades was essentially two versions of the same story running in parallel. Stephen cycled in and out of correctional facilities for the better part of the next 38 years. Armed robbery convictions, parole violations, a 30-year sentence from 1979 that swallowed almost everything. Robert's path ran through similar doors, though his charges stayed in the burglary lane. At one point in 1978, both brothers ended up at Auburn Correctional at the same time, and one of them attempted an elaborate jailbreak, hiding inside a concealed compartment in an army truck that inmates were servicing. The truck made it out. The twin inside did not get far. The problem was that the guards could never establish which Spahalski had been in that truck. They were that identical. So, according to the Democrat and Chronicle, both brothers were thrown into solitary. By 1989, Robert was out of Attica and back on the streets of Rochester, and he started making a living as a male sex worker. He became deeply addicted to crack cocaine, and he became HIV positive. Then came 1990. For 19 years, Stephen had been the brother with a body on his record. Robert's sheet was still just burglary after burglary, but that was about to change. And when it did, Robert wasn't just going to catch up to his twin. He was about to become Rochester's most prolific serial killer. On New Year's Eve, a 24-year-old woman named Maureen Armstrong was found dead in her Rochester apartment. She was wearing just one sock. Electrical cords were wrapped around her neck. And here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. When the police arrived at the scene, there was a tall, gaunt man standing near the tape. observing everything. He told officers he was a friend of the deceased. They took down his name, Robert Bruce Spahalski, and let him go without any interrogation or questioning. 7 months later, during a brutal July heatwave, neighbors on Emerson Street, less than 2 blocks from where Moraine had been found, called police about a smell coming from one of the apartments, and black flies were swarming the outside of the windows. When officers forced their way in, they found the body of 35-year-old Adrienne Berger. The decomposition was so severe in that heat that the medical examiner couldn't even determine how she had died. She was later identified as Robert's girlfriend, so investigators brought him in, but later had to let him go, as there was no strong evidence tying him to the crime at that time. 2 months after that, in October 1991, a landscape company owner named Charles Grand was found bludgeoned to death in Webster, just east of Rochester. He'd been beaten with a hammer from behind. And if that detail feels familiar, it should, because it is almost exactly what happened to Ronald Ripley in Elmira 20 years earlier. The murder Robert's own twin brother had confessed to. This time, Robert was actually charged. He went to trial, and unfortunately, he was acquitted. 3 murders, 3 separate investigations, 3 different jurisdictions, and absolutely no one was connecting the dots, because no one even knew there were dots to connect. Then came 14 years of silence. Robert, on his end, kept using drugs even as his health kept declining. He stayed sick. He had a long-term relationship with a woman named Christine Gonzalez that lasted until 2005. He was, as far as anyone could see, just a deeply troubled man with a long criminal record and a drug problem, who had somehow never managed to turn his life around. Until a Friday afternoon in early November 2005, when Robert smoked too much crack and his friend Vivian Irizarry came over. Vivian was 54 years old, and, by Robert's own description, a very good friend. She had come to his apartment at 202 Spencer Street to get high with him. According to his own later account, he watched her use a knife to open a bag of crack, and in that moment, something in his drug-fractured mind told him she had turned into a demon that needed to be destroyed. He struck her 3 times over the head with a blunt object. When she kept breathing, he strangled her with a piece of twine. He then bathed her body, moved her to the basement of the building where the temperature was cooler, and for several days, he went downstairs to visit her while crying and apologizing to her body. He later told investigators he couldn't bear the thought of Vivian ending up the way Adrienne had, with her body decomposing in a locked apartment while flies gathered at the windows. That image had haunted him for 14 years. He'd already tried to take his own life with pills. When that failed, he made a different decision. On the morning of Tuesday, November 8, 2005, Robert Bruce Spahalski put on his coat, walked to the Rochester Public Safety Building, approached the reception desk, and told the officer on duty that he had just killed someone. He gave the address. He gave the victim's name, and then he sat down and waited. What followed was a 13-hour interrogation, and Robert had only walked in to confess to 1 murder, just Vivian. But across those 13 hours, the other 3 came with it: Moraine Armstrong, Adrienne Berger, Charles Grande. He signed 4 separate written confessions, and every detail lined up with evidence that had been sitting in police files for over a decade. He described strangling Moraine with the electrical cords. He described killing Adrienne on the couch, his hands around her neck for 4 or 5 minutes, until he saw what he called yellow pinpricks in her eyes that told him it was over. He said that after killing Adrienne, he had turned the heat in her apartment all the way up, on purpose, to speed decomposition and throw investigators off. The exact detail that had stumped the medical examiner back in 1991. For 14 years, that had just sat in a file as an unexplained oddity. And now, finally, there was a man across the table who could explain it. In January 2006, Robert entered a not guilty plea, a complete reversal of everything he had confessed over those 13 hours. His attorney argued the confessions were unreliable because Robert had been mentally compromised by drug use and had gone without his psychiatric medication. The judge let them stand anyway. The trial ran 2 weeks. Prosecutors brought 40 witnesses and over 200 pieces of evidence. The defense's big move was placing 2 bags of drugs on the rail in front of the jury and saying, "The demon's here," and it affected his mind. The jury didn't buy it. He was convicted on 5 counts of second-degree murder. On December 13, 2006, Robert Spahalski was sentenced to 100 years to life imprisonment. The earliest he could possibly be released, according to New York State records, is November 7, 2105. He's currently at Great Meadows Correctional Facility. He was 52 at sentencing. True crime author Michael Benson spent years corresponding with Robert from prison, and at one point asked him directly how he had learned to kill. Robert told him that as a teenager, long before he ever touched another person, he had taken his father's favorite pig, put a gun to its head, and pulled the trigger. Benson asked if he had been angry at his father when he did it. Robert's answer was, "No, I felt like pork chops." Meanwhile, Stephen, on his end, was finally released in 2009 after serving his 30-year armed robbery sentence. And his story takes one last strange turn here. He lasted 6 months on the outside. Just 6 months before he walked into a bank in Elmira, handed the teller a note demanding money, and sat down to wait for the police. His attorney told local news this was likely institutionalization, which is a real, documented condition where someone who has spent decades inside a structured system simply cannot function once that structure is gone. Stephen got 300 days in the Chemung County Jail for it. As of 2016, he was reportedly living in a halfway house in Elmira. When a guard at Attica handed Stephen a newspaper clipping about his twins' 2005 confession, his reaction was telling. "I thought I was the only murderer in the family," he said, almost amused, as if finding out his twin had the same affinity for killing was somehow a point of pride. In the debate of nature versus nurture, the case of the Spahalski twins raises the question as to whether this was simply in their nature, that even decades apart, neither of them could stop committing crimes. Whether it's genetics, environment, or some combination of the two that no one has ever fully untangled, remains a question criminologists are still sitting with. And whatever it is, it left a mark on Elmira that the families of their victims have never fully recovered from. In the Henan province of rural China, a small rural county called Hojia, where the rhythm of life was slow, options were limited, and the fastest way out was to build something of your own. Two brothers grew up wanting more than the town could give them. Shen Changyin and Shen Changping had decided that they wanted to make some real money and make a name for themselves somewhere bigger. But before any of that could happen the way they probably pictured it, something else happened first. In September 1999, the elder brother, Changyin, supposedly stabbed a man to death for essaying the sister of a friend. The details of what actually happened that night are thin, as Chinese reporting from that period was sparse, and a lot of what actually happened never made it into any record outside Hojia. But what is certain is that both brothers left immediately. Their plan to get out of the city just became urgent. They weren't leaving Hojia anymore. They were running from it. For the next few years, the brothers drifted from province to province across China. Investigators later concluded it was almost certainly to stay ahead of anyone looking into that 1999 stabbing case. And it was during that rootless stretch that they finally landed somewhere. They decided to stop. Lanzhou, in Gansu province, hundreds of miles from home, where they decided to start an auto parts business. Both brothers will later pour every bit of their savings into this business and run it together. And unfortunately, the business failed and collapsed during the summer of 2003. And this led Changyin and Changping to make a decision that would cost 13 women their lives, in a case that would go on to shake China to its core. Despite the failure of their business, the brothers were determined to still make a lot of money, but this time they were going to try another means. And the means they landed on was about as simple and as brutal as it gets. Find people too weak or too vulnerable to fight back, and take everything those people had worked for. They started luring women to a rented property in Lanzhou under false pretenses, then forcing them to hand over their bank details and draining whatever was in the account. Their first victim was a woman named Yao Fang. They brought her to the house, tied her up, and forced her to give up her bank card PIN. One of the brothers went to a nearby ATM to check if it worked. When he came back and confirmed the money was there, they strangled her to death. Then they dismembered her body. That was June 2003. Changyin was 27, Changping was 20. From there, the brothers established a very systematic yet disturbing pattern of carrying out their operations. The brothers would specifically target women working in beauty salons and spas, using that world as the pipeline for their robbery and murder operation. And here's where this case stops being just another crime story and becomes something genuinely hard to sit with. Because it wasn't only the killing and the dismembering. According to multiple sources, including Shanghai Daily and China Underground's documented investigation, the brothers were removing their victims' kidneys and livers and eating them. That detail was confirmed in their own confessions and widely reported across Chinese state media at the time. It is the reason this case is still referenced in criminology discussions about organized predatory violence, because what the Shen brothers were running was not chaos. It was a system, and the cannibalism was part of it, not an accident of it. In late November 2003, they brought a woman named Li Chunling to the house the same way they'd brought in Yao Feng. But Li Chunling didn't die that day. And the reason she survived is one of the hardest parts of this entire case. She made the brothers an offer. She'd find more victims if they let her live. They agreed, and from that day, she became part of their operations. She started bringing women to the house herself, multiple times, over the following months, sometimes luring them, sometimes killing them herself, when the brothers told her to. By every legal and moral measure, she was a willing participant, and she has to be named as one. But she was also a woman who made that choice with a blade already at her throat, which is exactly why the court would later handle her case separately from the brothers. After each killing, the bodies were dissolved in sulfuric acid and flushed down the toilet. And there will be 11 women, over 14 months, disposed of that way. In April 2004, the brothers and Li Chunling moved to Taiyuan, in Shanxi province. They found a new rented house. They found a new victim to coerce into the same role, a woman named Zhao Meiying from Shanxi, who was given the same terrible choice Li Chunling had been given. She brought 3 women to the house to save her own life. The brothers forced her to stab one of them herself. The body was put through a meat processor before the chemical disposal. For a while, it seemed like the brothers were going to get away with all of this, until mid-2004, when Zhao Meiying surprisingly went to the police to confess to what the brothers were doing, likely calculating that cooperation was the only way out for her. The police moved immediately, and the first person they arrested was Li Chunling. And in August 2004, police tracked the brothers to an apartment in Shijiazhuang, in Hebei province. When officers entered, they found Chang Yin and Chang Ping with a new accomplice, a woman named Du Surong, in the middle of attempting to dissolve the dismembered body of their most recent victim, Wang Fengjuan, in acid. In that same house, the police found all their tools used, along with a dozen stolen bank cards, some cash and jewelry, totaling over 120,000 yuan, were recovered from the property. According to Xinhua News Agency, the scene investigators walked into was described as brutally dismembered. There was no ambiguity about what had been happening in that apartment. They were all immediately arrested, and the brothers confessed to all 11 murders. Cheng Yin additionally admitted to the 1999 stabbing back in Hojia. In September 2005, a Chinese court sentenced Shen Chengyin, Shen Chengping, and Li Chunling to death. The 3 other female accomplices, who had been between 16 and 26 years old at the time of the crimes, received sentences ranging from 3 to 20 years in prison. On April 27, 2006, Shen Changyin, aged 30, and Shen Changping, aged 23, were executed by lethal injection. Li Chunling was executed the same day. In China at that time, the distance between sentencing and execution was not long, and the case moved with a speed the Western criminal justice system rarely produces. It's worth noting that the exact number of victims the Shen brothers claimed is not entirely settled. Most sources cite 11 confirmed murders, while other reports place the figure as high as 13, with the discrepancy likely tied to cases that couldn't be fully verified through physical evidence alone. But here's the part of this case that doesn't get talked about enough. For 14 months, the women the Shen brothers killed were essentially invisible to any investigation, not because police were incompetent, but because of who those women were. Women working in the commercial sex industry, moving constantly between cities, with no fixed address, and nobody expecting a check-in. The brothers built their entire operation around that invisibility. They picked their victims because they calculated the disappearances wouldn't make noise. And for 14 months, they were right. Reginald and Jonathan Carr grew up in Dodge City, Kansas, in a household that gave them almost nothing to hold on to. Their parents' relationship was built on violence from the start. Their father abused their older sister. Then he left entirely. The men their mother brought into the house after that followed the same pattern. By the time the boys were teenagers, none of the things a child is supposed to be able to count on, safety, consistency, someone who actually shows up, had ever really existed for either of them. That is not an excuse for what they would go on to do. Nothing could be. But it's the ground this story grows out of. By December 2000, Reginald was 23, Jonathan was 20, and both already had criminal records to their names. They had recently relocated from Dodge City to Wichita, and within days of arriving, the two of them set off on a week-long crime spree that the press would later call the Wichita Massacre. By the time it was over, an entire city would be left reeling. Families were destroyed in ways that decades wouldn't undo, and Wichita itself would never quite feel the same again. It started on December 8th. Andrew Schreiber, a 23-year-old baseball coach at Wichita State University, had just made a quick stop at a convenience store. When he walked back out to his car, the Carr brothers were already there, waiting beside it. At gunpoint, they made him drive them around the city, hitting ATM after ATM, until his card finally got rejected. When they were done with him, they shot out his tires and walked off into the night. Schreiber survived and only managed to give the police a vague description of the two black males who attacked him. So police were left with nothing solid to go after the attackers. But the brothers weren't done. 3 days later, on December 11th, 55-year-old cellist and librarian Anne Walenta had just gotten home from work and was sitting in her car in her own driveway when the Carr brothers approached. She sensed something was wrong immediately and tried to pull away. They shot her 3 times before she could drive off. The impact threw her against the car horn, which produced a blaring sound, loud enough that neighbors came running, and the brothers fled before they could finish what they'd started. Emergency services were there within minutes. The gunshots had left Anne paralyzed, but she was alive and conscious enough to give police a description of her attackers. That description was enough for investigators to connect her shooting straight back to the Schreiber attack 3 days earlier. And at that point, according to crime scene investigator Kevin Brasser, everyone in the room understood the same thing. If these 2 men weren't found, this wasn't going to stop. It was only going to get worse. They were right. On the night of December 14th, the Carr brothers broke into a house at 12727 East Birchwood Drive in Wichita. Inside were 5 friends, all living together. There was a 26-year-old teacher and coach named Jason Beaufort, who was quietly carrying an engagement ring for his girlfriend. A 27-year-old man named Brad Haka, a 29-year-old man named Aaron Sander, who was studying to become a Catholic priest, a 25-year-old woman named Heather Muller. And the 5th person in that house was another 25-year-old woman the courts would only ever refer to as HG, to protect her identity. She was Jason's girlfriend. Wichita Police Sergeant Jim Merrick later described these 5 as the salt of the earth. Young professionals poised to go out and make a difference in the world. They had done nothing to invite what was about to happen to them. They were simply home. The brothers came in armed with handguns and golf clubs. They herded all 5 into one room and started going through the house. Under one of the beds, they found a popcorn tin, and inside it, an engagement ring. When they demanded to know whose it was, HG found out, in the worst possible moment imaginable, that Jason had been planning to propose to her. The brothers then took the 3 victims who had debit cards to ATMs across the city, one at a time, withdrawing cash until each card was maxed out. According to court documents later submitted to the U.S. Supreme Court, between midnight and 1 in the morning, they pulled nearly $2,000 from the victims' accounts. Then they came back to the house. What happened over the next hour was horrifyingly sick and twisted in ways that are genuinely hard to put into words. The brothers tied up the 5 friends and restrained them completely. The friends had no way to help each other or themselves. The men were beaten with golf clubs, again and again. The women were essayed, repeatedly, while the men were forced to watch. And then the men were forced to take part themselves, every moment of it, directed by the brothers, as if it were something only they wanted to see. The level of calculated degradation in what those 5 people were subjected to, in their own home, across that hour, was something that even the detectives who worked the case described as unlike anything they had encountered. When it was finally over, all 5 were loaded into 2 vehicles and driven to a snow-covered soccer field on the outskirts of the city. The brothers lined them up and shot each one in the back of the head, execution style. Then they drove a truck over the bodies and left. What the brothers didn't know was that one of the 5 was still alive. HG survived because of a plastic hair clip. It deflected the bullet that was meant to go through her skull, and the truck passed over her without crushing her. She lay there in the snow until she was sure the brothers were gone. She tried to reach Jason, and when she understood he was dead, she got up and walked nearly a mile through the snow. The temperature outside was sub-zero, and she was naked, but still she was able to climb over a barbed wire fence, followed the distant glow of a cross lit up in Christmas lights, until she reached a house, and pounded on the door. When the couple inside opened it, she was bleeding from the head and barely standing. "I need to tell you my story before I die," she told them. And when they called 911, she took the phone out of their hands. She needed to tell it herself. HG was able to recount everything she and her friends had gone through, and she gave the police a detailed description of their attackers. Within 24 hours, a massive task force brought in Reginald and then Jonathan, both caught while trying to flee. In their various apartments, they found a lot of previously reported stolen items, from electronics to clothes, and, most damning, Jason's diamond engagement ring. They also found a watch that had belonged to Andrew Schreiber, and wads of cash neither brother could explain. Anne Walenta, still hospitalized from the December 11th shooting, was able to positively identify Reginald as one of her attackers before she unfortunately died from a pulmonary embolism caused by the gunshot wounds on January 2, 2001. She became their 5th victim. Their entire trial lasted 3 weeks, and Andrew Schreiber, the brothers' very first victim, and the only one who'd walked away alive from any of this, testified about being kidnapped at gunpoint and driven from ATM to ATM. And then there was HG. She bravely took the stand and testified fully, and described in detail every single thing that happened in that house and in that field. In the end, both brothers were charged with first-degree murder. The jury found both brothers guilty on every count that mattered. Reginald was convicted on 50 counts, Jonathan on 43. Their defense team tried to argue for leniency, pointing to the brothers' own troubled upbringing, but the jury wasn't moved, and the verdict came back quickly. In October 2002, both Reginald and Jonathan were sentenced to death, plus multiple consecutive life terms for the crimes that didn't carry a capital charge. They've been on death row at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas ever since. What followed the sentencing was more than 2 decades of appeals. The Kansas Supreme Court overturned some of the convictions on procedural grounds in earlier hearings, and the brothers' attorneys have repeatedly argued that the joint sentencing hearing itself was legally flawed. As recently as January 2026, oral arguments were heard again before the Kansas Supreme Court over whether their death sentences still stand. The Sedgwick County District Attorney has opposed every single appeal, and the U.S. Supreme Court has already declined to hear the case. As of the time this was researched, both men remain on death row, still awaiting execution. Former FBI Special Agent Michael Tabman told killer siblings that trying to find a rational motive for what the Carr brothers did would be an exercise in futility. "What was their motivation?" he said. "We can't answer that. We can't find the motivation other than pure evil. And honestly, that's about as close to the truth as anyone's ever going to get." But here's something good that came out of all of this. HG and Andrew Schreiber met at the trial and quickly bonded, getting to know each other through the worst thing either of them had ever lived through. In 2004, HG and Andrew got married. Later that same year, she received a Teacher of the Year award. They're still together today, living in eastern Kansas. Out of everyone the Carr brothers tried to destroy, these two didn't just survive it, they built something good out of it. Their strength is really something to admire. Benjamin Matthew Williams and James Tyler Williams grew up in a household where religion was the entire atmosphere. Neighbors remembered their father, Benjamin Sr., as someone who would shout scripture while walking down the street, as he believed deeply and loudly that God punished those who failed to obey his laws. The family kept to themselves in Gridley, a farming community in Butte County, and the boys were not permitted to participate in extracurricular activities, to mix freely, or to engage with the wider world on their own terms. when the family relocated to Palo Cedro, near Redding in Northern California. Their father told neighbors it was on God's orders. The boys were being raised inside a sealed world, and the only map they were ever given for making sense of it was the one their father drew. Matthew, the elder brother, was 36 years old at that time, and briefly served in the Navy, stationed in Bremerton, Washington. It was afterwards, while living in Moscow, Idaho, that he became involved in something that would change his life forever. He started reading white supremacist and anti-Semitic literature, fell so deep into that world, and made contact with figures in the extremist movement, including white supremacist leaders Matt Hale and Alex Curtis, both of whom he called by phone frequently. Tyler, his younger brother by 3 years, also followed where Matthew led and began to share his interest. And by the summer of 1999, that ideology had already moved from words into action, and it will leave in its wake millions of dollars in damage. In the early hours of June 18, 1999, the two brothers set fire to 3 synagogues across the Sacramento area: B'nai Israel, Congregation Beth Shalom, and Knesset Israel Torah Center. The fires caused nearly $3 million in damage, with B'nai Israel being hit the hardest. This wasn't random vandalism. It was the same ideology Matthew had been absorbing for years, now actually being put into practice. And while the police were still investigating the suspects for this case, the brothers struck again. Back in Palo Cedro, the brothers ran a small landscaping and lawn service out of their parents' home. It was through that business that Matthew came to know Gary Mattson. Gary was 50 years old, held a master's degree in environmental horticulture from UC Davis, and had spent decades building something genuinely beautiful in the Redding community. He and his partner Winfield Mauder had founded a nursery together, Mattson Horticulture and Florabundance, and then an online plant business, plantstogo.com. Gary had helped establish a community garden to feed the hungry, co-founded what would become the Turtle Bay Exploration Park for children, and helped create the Redding Arboretum. He had a daughter from a previous marriage. He and Winfield had been together for 14 years. Winfield, 40 years old, held a degree in anthropology and spent part of his time speaking at local high schools. They both had become a source of support for gay and straight teenagers trying to figure out who they were. They had a booth at the Redding Farmers Market. Matthew Williams had a booth there too. They were acquaintances, possibly by some accounts friendly, and Matthew knew they were a gay couple. And that fact deeply unsettled Matthew. He could not stand it and decided to pass judgment on the couples. He told Tyler about the couple. He told Tyler they were homosexual, and that made them guilty of an unforgivable sin that they needed to be punished for. He began framing what he was planning not as murder, but as a biblical obligation. In the early hours of July 1st, 1999, the brothers drove to Gary and Winfield's home in Happy Valley in their father's Toyota Corolla. They got in with their intention very clear and forced one of the couple to record a new answering machine message, saying both were sick and heading to San Francisco for the week. However, in the background of the message, another voice can be heard saying, "Just calm down." Investigators concluded it was recorded under duress. The couple knew what was coming as the brothers ushered them to their bed, where they proceeded to climb onto the chairs at the foot of the bed, which stood 7 feet off the floor, and fired down into Gary and Winfield as they lay there. Matthew emptied a full magazine from his stock, reloaded and fired 5 more rounds. Gary was hit 5 times in the head and once in the back. Winfield was shot 7 times in the head and once in the neck. Matthew then drove off in Gary's Toyota Tercel. Tyler went home and went to sleep. The next morning, Gary's father, Oscar, tried calling and got that strange answering machine message instead and became worried. He sent Gary's brother, Roger, to check on them. Roger arrived around 1 in the afternoon and found them, in bed, exactly where the brothers had left them. When police arrived, they found out that nothing taken from the house, except Gary's car and his credit card. 2 hours later, Matthew used that card to order $2,276 worth of ammunition and firearms gear from a company in Scottsdale, Arizona, and had it shipped to a mail drop in Yuba City under Gary's name. That order is what gave them away. Detectives traced the address, and on the day the package was due, they staked out the mail drop and waited. And somehow, despite everything, both brothers showed up to collect it. Although both were armed and ready, Matthew was in a bulletproof vest. However, after a brief standoff, they surrendered, and police took them into custody. In their vehicle, officers found a sprinkler head converted into a homemade silencer. In their homes, they found white supremacist literature, a notebook where one of the brothers had been practicing Gary's signature, 13 pounds of black powder, and a letter from Matthew to National Alliance leader William Luther Pierce. The timing of the murders placed them in a broader and deeply alarming context. Gary and Winfield were killed on July 1, 1999. 3 days later, Benjamin Nathaniel Smith, a known associate of the same white supremacist organizations the Williams brothers had been consuming, launched a shooting spree across Illinois and Indiana, targeting racial and ethnic minorities over the July 4th weekend. The FBI opened an investigation into whether there was a coordinated conspiracy between these attacks and others that summer. That question was never definitively resolved. What was resolved was Matthew Williams's own account of his motivations. In November 1999, from jail, he began giving interviews. He admitted the murders to the Sacramento Bee and said that when he killed Gary and Winfield, he was obeying the law of God. He said homosexuality violated divine law, that the responsibility for the killings lay with the victims, and that he hoped his actions would inspire more. He expressed disappointment that more people who called themselves Christians did not have the courage to act as he had. He said he hoped to become a Christian martyr. He acknowledged the possibility of execution and said he welcomed it. While they were in custody on the murder charges, the ATF and FBI task force investigating the synagogue fires found forensic evidence connecting the Williams brothers to the arsons too. A federal grand jury formally indicted both brothers for the synagogue and abortion clinic arsons. In March 2000, a 13-count indictment charging conspiracy to terrorize Jews and reproductive health providers. In September 2001, both brothers pleaded guilty to the arson charges as part of a deal with federal prosecutors. Benjamin was sentenced to 30 years for planning and organizing the attacks. James got just over 21 years. They were also ordered to pay over $1 million in restitution to the synagogues and the clinic. However, a few days later, Matthew Williams was found dead in his jail cell, hanging by a bedsheet. He never stood trial. Tyler pleaded no contest to 2 counts of first-degree murder with hate crime enhancements and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated in the California state prison system. Hugh Pete Bondurant Jr. and Kenneth Patterson Bondurant, known to everyone in Giles County, Tennessee, simply as Pete and Pat, were fraternal twins born in April 1955 to parents who, by most accounts, were decent people. Their father worked as a military contractor. Their mother kept the home. Nothing about that family portrait, at least from the outside, explained what these 2 boys would eventually become. What people who knew them as children remembered most was their size. By 7th grade, Pete and Pat already weighed well over 250 pounds each. They were enormous, physically imposing, and they learned early exactly what that size could get them. They got used to fighting, and they got used to winning. And when you're bigger than every adult in the room, by the time you're 12, that tends to shape how you see the world. So they eventually bullied their way through high school. Pete committed the first known serious act of violence when he was 20 years old, living in Cincinnati in a directionless period of his life. One night in 1975, while his 2 female housemates were out buying cigarettes, Pete turned on the men, still in the apartment for reasons never revealed. By the time the women got back and knocked on the door, Pete answered, holding a bloody knife. He told them they were next. When they pushed past him inside, they found one of the male housemates on the couch, stabbed more than 40 times, mostly with a screwdriver, and another man bleeding out on the floor. The first man later died from his wounds. For a killing that frenzied, Pete was convicted and sentenced to 25 years. However, he only served 5 years because the prison became overcrowded at some point. And since he was an out-of-state inmate, the system decided to grant him parole, instead of transferring him to another prison. They decided to let him back into society. When Pete got out, he came back to Tennessee and reunited with his twin brother Pat. The 2 settled near their hometown of Elkton, ran a landscaping operation, and dealt drugs out of a rented farmhouse near the Shady Lawn truck stop north of town, where they proceeded to make a business out of selling every kind of drug anyone could imagine. And they did it with the easy generosity of men who understood that supply is power. The farmhouse became a magnet. People came to get high, to party, to be around the Bondurant boys, who are, by the way, now 300-pound, with unpredictable tempers and a reputation for spectacle. Pat, reportedly, used to sit down with a pound of raw hamburger and eat it by the handful in front of people, purely for effect. And that's the part that's hard to wrap my head around. Everyone around them knew these two men were violent, loud, unpredictable, and dangerous the second their temper turned. But somehow, that's exactly what drew people in. The farmhouse became a haven for addicts from all over the county, and not one of them seemed to think too hard about what it meant to keep showing up at a place run by two men everybody already knew could snap. It was only a matter of time before that magnet pulled in someone who would never walk back out. In May 1986, a 24-year-old single mother named Gwen Duggar came to the farmhouse. She had been watching the Williams brothers work on her brother's car, and decided to stay and hang out when her brother left. She told him she would be fine, and Pat said he would take her home later. That was the last time anyone outside that farmhouse saw Gwen Duggar alive. It didn't take long for people to notice Gwen was gone. Her family reported her missing, and because the last place anyone saw her was that farmhouse, investigators went straight there. Pat and Pete told them she'd left, that she'd gotten a ride from someone else, or just never showed up. The story shifted depending on who was asking. The community suspected the Bondurants immediately, but Pete and Pat had a response they used openly, almost as a boast: no body, no murder. And for 4 years, they were right. That same October, another man disappeared. Ronnie Gaines, known to everyone around Pulaski as Hippie, worked at the same rubber plant as Pat. He was well-liked and easygoing. Nobody had a bad word to say about him. A few nights before he vanished, he'd been at the farmhouse for a card game. Pat accused him of stealing his wallet. Gaines denied it. That was it. That was the entire dispute. A few days later, Gaines was gone, and his house was a pile of ashes. Investigators suspected Pat immediately and brought him in for questioning. He showed up with an attorney and an alibi already lined up. His girlfriend, Terry Lynn Clark. Pat told investigators Clark had been with him out of town the night Ronnie disappeared. Investigators then scheduled an interview with Clark for November 18, 1986. 2 days before that interview was set to happen, she was found dead inside the Bondurant home. Surprisingly, it was the brothers who called it in themselves. They claimed she'd passed away in her sleep, or maybe from an overdose, while in bed with Pete. At this point, Pat's alibi could never be confirmed or denied by the one person who could have confirmed or denied it, so he wasn't arrested nor charged. 3 murders in 1 year, 3 people gone. No bodies, no physical evidence, and a pair of brothers too large, too confident, and too lawyered up to touch. The case sat. For 3 years, it looked like the Bondurants were going to get away with all of it. Until late 1989, when Detective Michael Chapman inherited the Duggar case, and he found Denise Bondurant. She was Pat's ex-wife, and had lived alongside the brothers at that farmhouse for years, and she'd been there when Gwen Duggar went missing. By this time, she and Pat were long divorced, and she was now dating a police officer. Chapman offered her immunity from prosecution. And Denise talked. What she described shocked investigators, who thought they'd seen everything in this job. Former narcotics investigator Jim Story put it to killer siblings on oxygen this way: "Brutality is not strange to me, but these two brothers were beasts." Denise told them everything about that night in May 1986. How Gwen had been given pills throughout the evening by the brothers and 2 other men in the house until she was barely conscious, too out of it to leave, too out of it to say no to anything. At some point that night, Denise had walked into a bedroom and found her husband with Gwen, who by then could barely hold her own head up. Her reaction wasn't to help her, it was rage. She screamed at Pat, then turned on Gwen herself, slapping a woman who could barely register what was happening to her, hopefully to wake her up. That's when it turned fatal. Pat grabbed an axe handle and brought it down on Gwen's head. The first blow buckled her knees, the second dropped her to the floor. Pete walked in moments later, pulled out a taut .22 caliber pistol, and fired 2 bullets into her head to make sure she actually died. And then over the next 3 nights, the brothers dismembered her and burned her body in the backyard until nothing was left but ash, and dumped the ash in a nearby creek. That is why there was no trace of their victims. Thankfully, Denise's testimony cracked all 3 cases wide open. In May 1990, investigators searched the property belonging to the twins' parents in Pulaski and found skull fragments buried in the yard. DNA testing confirmed they belonged to Ronnie Gaines, the man Pat had killed over a wallet that, as Pat later admitted, he'd actually just misplaced. Pat had beaten Gaines' head in with a small wooden rocking chair until the chair itself splintered apart. Then Pete arrived, and together they dismembered Gaines' body in the bathtub of his own home, buried the pieces across the family property, and burned the house down. And with everything reopening, a witness who'd stayed quiet for years finally came forward and told police they'd seen Pete injecting Clark repeatedly with a powerful barbiturate called secobarbital, basically a heavy-duty sedative, once prescribed as a sleeping pill, that in high enough doses can shut the body down completely. He did this while she sat barely conscious in a beanbag chair, the day before she was found dead. With Denise's testimony on record, both brothers were finally arrested in 1990. What followed were years of separate and joint proceedings, working through everything she'd revealed. In 1991, both Pete and Pat were convicted of second-degree murder for killing Gwen Duggar, second degree, not first, and only 25 years each, largely because her body had never actually been recovered. Even with a full confession from someone who'd witnessed the whole thing, no body still worked in their favor. Pat was separately convicted of murdering Ronnie Gaines and burning down his house to cover it up. He was initially sentenced to death for it, but in 1999 was granted a new trial and resentenced to 65 years. Pete was convicted for his part in dismembering Gaines' body, and separately for the death of Terry Lynn Clark, receiving 15 years for Clark's murder. Both years added to their previous sentence. However, Pete Bondurant was released from prison on December 21, 2016, after serving 26 years, a release that outraged the communities in Giles County and Limestone County, Alabama, who had lived under the shadow of these cases for decades. Pat, meanwhile, remains incarcerated at the Northeast Correctional Complex in Mountain City, Tennessee, with a sentence that doesn't end until 2070. He's applied for parole. He's been denied every time. And hopefully he stays there, so the people his victims left behind can still feel some sense of justice. Anthony Cook was born in Mobile, Alabama, on March 9, 1949. His younger brother Nathaniel arrived 9 years later, on October 25, 1958, a gap wide enough that the two of them never really grew up together. By the time Nathaniel was still a child, Anthony was already a teenager, moving through a world that seemed to offer him very little resistance and even less consequence. What actually shaped Anthony Cook in those early years isn't something the record lays out. What the record does show is that by the time he was 24, living in Toledo, Ohio, he had already killed someone. In December 1973, Anthony abducted a young woman named Vicky Small near St. Vincent Mercy Medical Center in Toledo and killed her. He wasn't caught. He wasn't even seriously looked at. He just went on with his life, and that murder sat untouched in a cold case file for almost 30 years, until 2000, when he finally confessed to it, as part of a plea deal that, by the end, closed out a list of crimes so long it took investigators years just to put it all together. In July 1974, Anthony was convicted of armed robbery and sent to prison. He was paroled on November 13, 1979, after serving 5 years. Within months, he was back on the streets of Toledo. And almost immediately, he started killing again. Only this time, he had his younger brother with him. Between May 1980 and September 1981, Anthony and Nathaniel Cook ran what became the most prolific serial killing operation in Toledo's recorded history. Mostly, they went after couples, young people parked in cars late at night, or walking home together after dark, in that specific moment when two people are wrapped up in each other and not paying attention to the street around them. For whatever reason, the two of them seemed to carry a deep-rooted hatred for couples specifically. When Anthony finally confessed in 2000, he didn't show a flicker of remorse. He talked about stalking those couples with something close to pride, walking detectives through his techniques, step by step, the same way someone might walk you through a skill they'd spent years getting good at. That's not someone unburdening themselves, that's someone showing off. The first attack the two of them carried out together happened on May 13, 1980. 24-year-old Thomas Gordon and his 18-year-old girlfriend, Sandra Podgorski, were sitting in Gordon's car on Utica Street in North Toledo. The brothers approached at gunpoint, forced the couple into the car, and drove them out to the woodlands in western Lucas County. When Thomas tried to run, Nathaniel shot and killed him. Sandra was essayed and stabbed repeatedly with an awl, a sharp, pointed tool, and left for dead in the dark. She survived and was able to tell police what had happened. But the description of the attackers was vague enough that investigators had very little to go on, so police put out a public reward of $1,000 for anyone with information on the two men. Nobody came forward. Detective Frank Stiles, the lead investigator who would spend years hunting the Cook brothers, noted immediately that the attack bore hallmarks of something organized, something experienced, and he was right. 8 months later, on January 3, 1981, it happened again. A 19-year-old redhead named Connie Sue Thompson from Michigan was hitchhiking in Toledo when the brothers picked her up. They drove her out to the same general area near the Langdon-Durfer and Bancroft Culvert in Lucas County, essayed her, and stabbed her 43 times. Her body was found on January 17th by 2 teenagers who were out sledding. Stiles stood at that scene and knew, without being able to prove it yet, that the same people who had attacked Sandra Podgorski and killed Thomas Gordon had just killed Connie Thompson. The weapon, the location, the method. It was the same signature, and he knew it was going to happen again. He was right about that too. On February 22, 1981, 12-year-old Don Bax was walking home near the University of Toledo after a night out with friends. Anthony Cook was prowling the streets in his pickup truck. He spotted her, calculated her route, looped around to the next street, parked at an intersection she would have to pass, and waited. Dawn wasn't part of a couple. She was a 12-year-old girl, walking home alone, and by this point, whatever pattern the brothers had started with didn't seem to matter anymore. Anyone vulnerable would do. He grabbed her from behind and forced her into the truck. He then drove to pick up Nathaniel, and together they took Dawn to an abandoned theater, the Old State Theater on Collingwood Boulevard, a building they knew well because they'd spent months inside it stripping copper from the walls. They led her into the darkened basement, blindfolded her, and essayed her. Then they killed her by repeatedly dropping a cinder block on her head. Dawn was found in that basement. The news of her death shocked everyone, and her mother Sharon was devastated and relentless. She showed up at the police station and called Detective Stiles nearly every day after that, determined that whoever had done this to her daughter would not walk free. The community grieved alongside her. A classmate wrote a poem about Dawn, about her big brown eyes, a heart full of gold, and the way she would never walk on a neighbor's lawn because she didn't want to be disrespectful. She was 12 years old, and the brothers weren't done, not even close. On January 27, 1981, between the Thompson and Bax murders, the brothers attacked 18-year-old Cheryl Bartlett and her 22-year-old fiancé, Bud Coates, as they walked home together late at night after his shift at a Toledo grocery store. The brothers forced them into an alley, then into a garage, where Cheryl was essayed. One of the brothers told Bud to hold her tight, because it was the last time he'd ever hold her. A bullet was fired into Cheryl's back. Investigators believe there was only one bullet, and the brothers were hoping it would pass through Cheryl and kill Bud too. It didn't. Cheryl screamed and ran to a nearby house. Bud was left standing in that garage, unshot, with everything that had just happened still hanging in the air around him. Cheryl survived the bullet, but it fragmented inside her body. She's had 20 surgeries. She's lived with the physical consequences of that night for more than 40 years. And Anthony wasn't slowing down. On March 27, 1981, he broke into an apartment in Oregon, a suburb east of Toledo, where he found 21-year-old Scott Moulton and 22-year-old Denise Siatkowski. He assaulted Denise, then shot them both. This time, Nathaniel wasn't there. Anthony had done it entirely on his own. Then, on August 21st, he did it again, this time targeting 31-year-old Daryl Cole and his 21-year-old girlfriend, Stacy Bolonek. He beat both of them to death with a baseball bat after assaulting Stacy. Her brother Mitch told Fox News years later that his family had no idea who had killed his sister until Anthony's 2000 confession finally gave them an answer they had waited nearly 2 decades for. By late 1981, Nathaniel had apparently reached some kind of limit. For reasons that were never fully explained, he stopped participating in the killings. Anthony didn't. In September 1981, Anthony tried to abduct a young couple, University of Toledo wrestler Todd Sabo and his girlfriend Leslie Sawicki, from a parking lot at an apartment complex. Leslie broke free and got inside. Sabo wrestled the gun out of Anthony's hand. Leslie called the police, then called her father. Her father, Peter Sawicki, a 43-year-old real estate developer and a prominent member of the Ottawa Hills community, drove straight there. He found Anthony and started beating him. And while he was on the ground being beaten, Anthony worked his way back to the gun, shot and killed Peter Sawicki, and shot Todd Sabo in the neck. Sabo survived. Anthony fled. Weeks later, an informant gave him up, and he was pulled over on the interstate. He surrendered without incident. In March 1982, he was convicted of Peter Sawicki's murder, and he's been in prison ever since. Nathaniel stayed free for 16 more years. That is, until 1997, when Lucas County prosecutor Julia Bates went to a conference on DNA evidence and came back with an idea. She had old biological material from the Podgorski assay, all the way back from 1980, tested, and it came back a match for Nathaniel. He was finally arrested, and both brothers were brought in, and Bates negotiated a deal. In exchange for full videotaped confessions to every killing and essay they'd committed in Lucas County, Nathaniel, a man who had never actually been convicted of any of it, would be released after 20 years. Anthony, already serving life, would stay exactly where he was. The victims' families were consulted. Some agreed reluctantly, believing it was the only way to get the full truth on record. Others have regretted it every day since, especially Dawn Baca's mother, Sharon, who told WTOL 11 that when Nathaniel walked free, she felt like she'd betrayed her own daughter. And honestly, it's hard to argue with that. 20 years in exchange for confessing to helping kill a 12-year-old. That seems hardly fair. Nathaniel Cook was released from prison on August 9, 2018. He lives in Toledo. He has a Jesus sign on the door of his house. When a reporter from WTOL asked if he had any regrets, he said he'd done his time and was moving on. He offered nothing further. Anthony Cook, now 76, remains incarcerated at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio. He's applied for parole multiple times and been denied every time. His most recent denial means he can't apply again until 2034, when he'll be 85. Detective Frank Stiles, now retired, put it plainly when asked about the prospect of Anthony Cook's release. He's just a cold-blooded killer. If they let him out, it wouldn't be hardly any time at all before he would kill somebody. I don't have a question in my mind. Linwood Earl Briley, James Dyrell Briley Jr., and Anthony Ray Briley grew up on 4th Avenue in the northeast side of Richmond, Virginia, in a household that, by most external accounts, was a stable one. Their parents were present. Their home was kept. The brothers grew up in a good family with loving parents. Neighbors remembered them as boys who would help fix cars or mow lawns without being asked. They were, on the surface, the kind of kids a neighborhood feels easy around. But inside that house on 4th Avenue, something sinister was taking shape. The brothers kept an unusual collection of pets: tarantulas, piranhas, Dobermans, boa constrictors, and they watched with obvious pleasure when they fed live mice to the snakes. It was the kind of detail that reads differently in hindsight. A fondness for watching something smaller and weaker suffer. A comfort with cruelty that most children grow out of, or never develop at all, that in the Briley brothers appeared to calcify into something permanent. And it didn't stay contained to the snake tank. Whatever this was, it started bleeding into how they treated everyone around them, to the point where the people who should have known these boys best were the ones most afraid of them. Their father, James Briley Sr., was so unsettled by his own sons that he started padlocking his bedroom door from the inside every night just to sleep without fear. He was reportedly the only person the brothers were ever afraid of in return. Their mother, Bertha, eventually moved out of the house entirely. She simply didn't feel safe living under the same roof as her own children anymore. These brothers became so terrifying and downright evil, with all three of them manifesting the same level of cruelty and the same predatory instinct toward anyone they saw as weaker. Without hesitation, without a second thought, that it begs the question of whether these boys were simply born to kill. Because not long after, the three of them would go on to form one of the deadliest gangs Richmond had ever seen. Linwood, the eldest, born in March 1954, was the one who set the direction. He always had been. And in 1971, when he was 16 years old, Linwood shot and killed a 57-year-old woman named Orline Christian. She was hanging wet laundry on her clothesline in the backyard when Linwood fired a rifle at her from his window. She died instantly. Investigators initially suspected a heart attack. It was only when a funeral home employee noticed a small hole in her dress and dried blood beneath it that the truth came forward. Police traced the shot back to Linwood's window. He claimed he had been shooting at squirrels. When that story collapsed, he admitted he had done it deliberately, and then offered the explanation that has stayed attached to his name ever since. He had heard she had heart problems and would have died soon anyway. He was sent to a reform school where he only served a year. James followed him there shortly after, arrested for firing a gun at a police officer. Anthony, the youngest, born in February 1958, watched his older brothers cycle through the system and come back the same, or worse, each time. By the time all three were adults and back together in Richmond, the template was already set. Linwood led, the others followed, and a teenage neighbor named Duncan Meekins, 16 years old and hungry for belonging, attached himself to the group and became the fourth member of what would be remembered as one of the most brutal killing gangs in Virginia history, the Briley Gang. The spree began on March 12, 1979, when Linwood knocked on the door of an elderly couple, William and Virginia Booker, in Henrico County, claiming he had car trouble and needed to use their phone. When they let him in, he pulled a gun and waved Anthony inside. The two tied the couple up, stripped the house of everything worth taking, doused every room with kerosene, tossed a match, and drove away. William Booker managed to free himself and his wife from the restraints which Meekins had tied too loosely, and they escaped just before the house was consumed. The Bookers were the only people to survive an encounter with the Briley Gang. Everyone after them was not as fortunate. A little over a week later, a machine serviceman was robbed and murdered in his own home. The following month, 76-year-old Mary Gowan was essayed, robbed, and shot to death. In July, a 17-year-old named Christopher Phillips made the mistake of lingering near the brothers' vehicle. They dragged him to a field, beat him, and Linwood finished it by dropping a cinder block on his head. In September, a well-liked local country western DJ named Johnny Gallagher stepped outside during a gig for a cigarette and never came back. His car was found empty. 2 weeks later, his body turned up, shot in the back of the head with a rifle. According to investigators interviewed on Killer Siblings, the gang had noticed his shiny belt buckle. They killed him for it. Then October arrived, and the killings became something else entirely. On October 5th, the brothers forced their way into the home of 79-year-old Blanche Page. She was beaten so severely that investigators later described her as unrecognizable. Her 59-year-old boarder, Charles Garner, was beaten too, and then pinned to the floor with knives, scissors, and a fork. According to the Washington Post's coverage of the subsequent trials, Garner was left like that, nailed to his own floor, until he died. 14 days later, on October 19, 1979, the Briley Gang committed what would become their final and most devastating crime. That same morning, as court records later confirmed, James Briley had stood before a judge on an unrelated matter and vowed to turn his life around. That evening, the four of them assembled at the Briley home on 4th Avenue, drank alcohol, smoked marijuana, and drove to the home of Harvey Wilkerson, a man who was an acquaintance of the brothers. Harvey's pregnant partner, Judy Barton, was there. So was her 5-year-old son, also named Harvey. 3 members of the gang essayed Judy in front of her partner and her child. Then all 3 were killed. The family's bodies were not discovered for 3 days. A surveillance task force that had been monitoring the area helped connect the murders to the Brileys almost immediately. Linwood and Meekins were arrested after a brief car chase. James and Anthony turned themselves in. When police had them all in custody, the gang said nothing. They gave up nothing. It was only when Duncan Meekins negotiated a plea deal and agreed to testify against the brothers that the full picture of the 7-month spree began to come into focus, with at least 11 confirmed victims, possibly as many as 20, across Richmond and its surrounding areas. Prosecutors concentrated on the charges most likely to secure permanent sentences, and they succeeded. Anthony received life in prison. Linwood and James were both sentenced to death. But the story did not end there. Because in May 1984, 2 months before their scheduled execution date, Linwood and James Briley led the only successful death row escape in Virginia's recorded history. breaking out of the Mecklenburg Correctional Center, along with 4 other inmates. They made their way to Philadelphia, where they stayed comfortably with friends for nearly 2 weeks. Meanwhile, police and FBI agents quietly tracked them north. One afternoon, law enforcement surrounded a house in Philadelphia, where Linwood and James were outside, holding a barbecue. They surrendered without incident. Linwood Briley was executed in Virginia's electric chair on October 12, 1984. He was 30 years old. James followed on April 18, 1985. He was 28. Anthony Ray Briley, the youngest of the 3, remains incarcerated at the Lawrenceville Correctional Center in Virginia. He is currently 67 years old. What made the Briley brothers a distinct category of criminal, according to investigators who worked the case, was not just the scale of the killing, but the motivation behind it. The robberies were real, but they were incidental. The Washington Post's reporting on the trials, and every investigator who spoke publicly about the case afterward, drew the same conclusion. The Brileys did not kill to steal, they stole as an excuse to kill. The violence was the point. The money and the valuables were just the reason they gave themselves to go to the door. What they were actually doing every time was hunting. And they did it inside the same city, where everyone knew their faces, where neighbors had watched them grow up, where people had hired them to mow their lawns. Richmond never fully recovered from the understanding of what had been living in its streets. Alan, David, and James Fryer were brothers from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. 3 men who, on the surface, blended into the quiet fabric of the rural Great Plains without distinction. Alan was the eldest at 29. David was 24. James was 21. There is very little in the public record about their upbringing, or what their household looked like on the inside. What investigators and court documents established about them was largely assembled after the fact, from what they did on a single November night in 1973, and from the chilling coherence with which 3 brothers moved together towards something that none of them apparently tried to stop. On the evening of November 17, 1973, the Fryer brothers drove to Gitche-Manitou State Preserve, a stretch of ancient quartzite rock and woodlands sitting on the Iowa side of the South Dakota border, about 15 miles from Sioux Falls, with shotguns in their vehicle and the intention of poaching deer after dark. Hunting in the state preserve was illegal. That was the extent of what they had planned when they arrived. Unfortunately, 5 teenagers from Sioux Falls had arrived there earlier that same evening, with no particular plan at all, beyond spending a night outside together. Stuart Bard was 18 years old. His younger brother Dana was 14. Their friend Michael Hadrath was 15. Roger Essam was 17, and he had brought his 13-year-old girlfriend, Sandra Chesky, along with him. The 5 of them settled around a campfire, sang songs, passed a marijuana cigarette between them, and did what teenagers do when they have a few hours of freedom and nowhere specific to be. It was an ordinary evening. It was supposed to stay that way. When the Fryer brothers came through the tree line and smelled the marijuana smoke drifting from the campfire, something shifted in what they had decided to do that night. According to Sandra Chesky's testimony, the account that would become the spine of every prosecution that followed, the 3 brothers approached the group and identified themselves as narcotics officers. They said they were there to confiscate the marijuana. The teenagers, confronted by 3 adult men claiming to be law enforcement, had no reason to disbelieve them and no framework for understanding what was actually happening. They complied. And then, without warning, the Fryers opened fire. Roger Essam was killed instantly in the first volley of shotgun fire. Stuart Bard and Michael Hadrath were wounded as the others scattered into the dark. The Fryers shouted for the surviving teenagers to come back out of the trees. Still maintaining the fiction that they were officers, they marched Stuart, Dana, and Michael to the road and lined them up beside Stuart's van. Alan Fryer separated Sandra from the group, put her in their truck, and drove away with her. According to court records citing David Fryer's own statement and Sandra's testimony, what Alan told the others before he left was that she was too young to get busted, that she would be released. James and David stayed behind with the 3 boys. According to David Fryer's statement, and confirmed by the Iowa Supreme Court record in the subsequent appeals, what happened next on that roadside was methodical. James started the van, reversed it, turned it to face the boys standing on the road, and stepped out. He shot Dana Bade first. And then David shot Stuart in the back as he fell. Michael Hadrath was killed. By the time they were done, 4 teenagers were dead on or near that road in the dark. Roger, where he had fallen at the campfire, and the other 3 on the roadside where they had been lined up. A couple visiting the preserve found 3 of the bodies the following day, and investigators located Roger's body a day after that. Alan, meanwhile, had driven Sandra Chesky to a farmhouse nearby, later identified as belonging to Alan's employer, where the brothers regrouped and James S.'d Sandra at the farmhouse until the following day, when the brothers drove her back to Sioux Falls and dropped her at home. She went inside, and for a period of time, she told almost no one what had happened. It was Sandra who broke the case open, regardless. She could describe the farmhouse, the brothers' faces, the sequence of exactly what had happened from the moment the 3 men walked out of the trees. Investigators from the South Dakota Police Department and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation worked the case jointly, and Sandra's account gave them everything they needed to move. The friars were identified and arrested. All 3 were tried separately. David pleaded guilty in February 1974 to 3 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter, and was sentenced to life in prison. Alan went to trial in May 1974 and was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder, receiving 4 consecutive life sentences. James was convicted in December 1974 on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of manslaughter. All 3 received life without the possibility of parole. In June 1974, between Alan's conviction and James' trial, Alan and James escaped from the Lyon County Jail. They stole a vehicle and fled the state. They were later arrested in Gillette, Wyoming, and returned to Iowa to face federal charges on top of everything else. It added time and complication to proceedings that were already among the most serious in Iowa's history. And it underlines something about the brothers that the original crime had already made plain. They operated as a unit. Even the escape was something they did together. Sandra Chesky's story remained largely private for decades. She did not speak publicly about what happened to her at Gitche, Manitou for more than 40 years, carrying the weight of that November night through her adult life, her relationships, and everything that followed. It was only in 2016 that a book called Gitche Girl, written by Phil and Sandy Hammond and based on Sandra's account, brought the full story to a wider audience for the first time. A follow-up, Gitche Girl Uncovered, expanded the record further. As of the 50th anniversary of the murders in November 2023, all 3 Fryer brothers remain incarcerated at the Fort Dodge Correctional Facility in Iowa. Alan is 79 years old, David is 74, James is 71. None of them has been released. None of them is scheduled for release. Danny Arthur Rains and Larry Lee Rains were born 18 months apart in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Danny in October 1943, Larry in March 1945, and they grew up in a household that left marks on both of them that neither ever fully shook. Their father was volatile and authoritarian, and from the time they were small, he made a habit of pitting the 2 boys against each other, sometimes over something as trivial as a handful of cents. He also encouraged them to drink alcohol as children, which would go on to cause lasting damage in both of their lives. Then, in 1954, when Larry was 9 and Danny was 11, their father left for good. He moved to Florida and found work as a gas station attendant. And whatever that household set in motion, it sent both boys down a path that criminologists still talk about today, because what happened with the Rains brothers is genuinely rare. Both of them grew up to become serial killers, separately. At different times, with different victims, different methods, even different accomplices, and as far as anyone has ever been able to tell, neither one knew what the other had done until it was already over. Larry went first. After the family fell apart, Larry's adolescence was defined by instability and a series of attachments that never held. At 13, he became close with a 23-year-old neighbor named Sue, a single mother, and spent years helping raise her children, eventually developing a romantic relationship with her that she never reciprocated the way he needed. He dropped out of high school in 10th grade. He stole a car in 1962 and, rather than face prosecution, agreed to enlist in the Army. The Army did not go well. He was disciplined repeatedly for misconduct and chronic alcoholism, attacked a colleague in a drunken episode in 1963, and was discharged and sent back to Kalamazoo. He came home to find that while he had been away, Danny had married Kathy, a girl they had both been interested in from high school. On December 23, 1963, Larry attempted to kill himself by sitting in his car with the exhaust running. A police officer found him, and he was taken to Kalamazoo Regional Psychiatric Hospital, where he spent 10 days. After he was released, he kept asking Sue to marry him. She kept saying no. And in the spring of 1964, Larry Lee Raines began killing people. His initial approach was robbery. He posed as a hitchhiker, accepted lifts, and turned on whoever had been generous enough to stop for him. On April 6, 1964, a 21-year-old Air Force serviceman named Vernon LeBen was shot at the gas station where he worked near Battle Creek, the day before he was due to be married. On May 30th, a 30-year-old junior high school teacher named Gary Smock picked up a hitchhiker on his way back from Battle Creek, where he had been looking for a venue to host a youth event for his church. Larry forced Smock into the trunk of his own car, drove, and when Smock tried to push the trunk open, Larry stopped and shot him twice in the back of the head. He took $3 and a watch. That same day, he killed a gas station attendant named Charles Snyder in Elkhart, Indiana. He will later confess to 2 further murders, one in Las Vegas, one in Kentucky, whose victims he could not fully name. 5 people dead across multiple states, in a matter of weeks, by a 19-year-old man who told multiple acquaintances what he had done and was arrested on June 5, 1964, outside a friend's house, making no particular effort to disappear. And when police brought him in, he confessed immediately to all of it. Although the examining doctors concluded that the psychological trauma of his childhood had generated a subconscious targeting of gas stations, places that reminded him of the father who had left, a psychiatric examination found him legally insane, so he was fit to stand trial. However, the state, unfortunately, could only try him for the murder of Gary Smock, and he was convicted in October 1964 and sentenced to life without parole. He was only 19 years old at the time. And then, 8 years later, his older brother Danny started killing too. After Larry's conviction and imprisonment, Danny's life began unraveling in its own direction. His marriage deteriorated. In November 1968, he forced his way into an 18-year-old woman's car at gunpoint in Battle Creek and attempted to drive her to a remote area before she escaped. When he took a wrong turn, he was arrested, convicted of felonious assault, and sentenced to 3 to 4 years. His wife divorced him while he was inside. He was paroled on February 17, 1972, returned to Kalamazoo, and found work operating a gas station, the same occupation his absent father had taken up in Florida 18 years earlier. There, he met a 15-year-old vagrant named Brent Coster, a boy from a severely dysfunctional home with a schizophrenic mother and an alcoholic father. Danny gave Coster a place to stay and got him a job. Coster, with no other anchor in his life, attached himself completely. He would follow Danny anywhere. On March 19, 1972, Danny kidnapped, essayed, and killed 28-year-old Patricia Houck. He told Coster about it afterward, and Coster didn't recoil. If anything, it seemed to pull him closer, like the two of them had found something they could share. On July 5th, 2 19-year-old women from Chicago, Linda Clark and Claudia Bidstrup, stopped for gas at the station on Sprinkle Road, where Danny was working. According to Coster's later testimony, both men held the women at knife point, essayed them, and strangled them together with a rope. Then Coster wrapped the bodies in a blanket, drove the car to a wooded area near Galesburg, and tried to set it on fire. The remains were found 2 weeks later by a passing motorcyclist, and they were just getting started. On August 5th, 18-year-old Pamela Fearnow was hitchhiking near Western Michigan University when Danny and Coster picked her up. They drove her to Woodland near Morrow Lake, essayed her repeatedly, and Danny strangled her with a plastic bag. For a while, it looked like they might actually get away with all of it. But Coster had a problem Danny couldn't control. He couldn't keep his mouth shut. No matter how many times Danny told him to stay quiet, Coster kept boasting about what they'd done to anyone who'd listen. And eventually, he boasted to the wrong person. That person happened to be a police informant. Coster was arrested on September 5, 1972, and gave investigators everything: names, locations, the confession Danny had shared with him about Patricia Houck. Danny was arrested the same evening. At trial, Coster testified for the prosecution in exchange for a plea deal that gave him a chance at eventual parole. Danny was convicted of first-degree murder for Pamela Fearnow's, second-degree murder for Patricia Houck's, and pleaded no contest to 2 additional counts for Linda Clark and Claudia Bidstrup. He received life without parole, plus 2 additional life terms. The judge told Koster at sentencing that he deserved to die in prison, and that people like him were the reason some wanted the death penalty reinstated in Michigan. In the early 1970s, while serving his sentence, Larry changed his name. He chose Monk Steppenwolf, after the protagonist of a Hermann Hesse novel he had read in prison in 1967. He told journalists in a 1986 interview that his brother's crimes had turned the family name into a personification of evil, and that was his primary reason for leaving it behind. He said he and Danny had not spoken to each other since the late 1960s. He spoke about Danny without emotion. He would eventually marry Danny's ex-wife, the same Kathy they had both been interested in during high school, on his 31st birthday in 1976. Danny Rains died in prison on January 29, 2022. Larry Rains died on November 12, 2023, aged 78, at a correctional facility in Freeland, Michigan. The Crime Library described their case as the only known instance in the United States of a single family producing 2 separate serial killers operating in entirely unrelated incidents. Criminologist Catherine Ramsland, writing in Psychology Today, said she had studied killing families and killing teams for years and had never encountered anything quite like it. Massacre and Wiley Harpe were born in Orange County, North Carolina, in the late 1760s. Massacre first, Wiley following roughly 2 years behind him. Their fathers were Scottish immigrants, Tory loyalists, who had sided with the British during the Revolutionary War, and that political allegiance would shape everything that came after. When the war turned against the British, and loyalists became targets of Patriot retribution, the boys' fathers fled. Massacre and Wiley were left behind, growing up poor, ostracized, and permanently marked in their communities as sons of traitors. They grew up fighting, they grew up stealing. And somewhere in that rootless, resentful childhood, something in both of them curdled into something that the world around them had never quite seen before. Historians and criminologists who have studied the Harpe case, and the academic interest in it has grown considerably in recent years, including a University of Connecticut fellowship project dedicated specifically to their murders and the violent legacies of the Revolution. Generally describe Massacre and Wiley as the earliest documented serial killers in United States history. Not outlaws who killed in the course of robbery. Not men who murdered for territory or survival. Men who killed because they enjoyed it. Across multiple states over several years, with a consistency and a signature that places them in a category that would not have a name for another 2 centuries. Yukon historian Emma Schiavone, whose research focuses specifically on the Harpe murders, has written that they did not kill for money or possessions. They appeared to be striking back against the young nation itself. They killed men, women, and children. No one was outside the category of acceptable victim. In the years following the Revolution, Massacre and Wiley drifted into Cherokee territory and lived with the community at Nickajack for roughly a decade, raiding settlements and learning from a people who had their own reasons to resist American expansion. They kidnapped women during this period, including Susan Wood, the daughter of a Patriot militia captain, who Massacre claimed as his wife. By 1794, when they learned that a militia raid on Nickajack was imminent, the brothers did not warn their hosts. They simply left. They surfaced near Knoxville around 1797, traveling with a small group of women, some kidnapped, some who had joined them willingly, and several children. Massacre stood 6 feet 4 inches and was known as Big Harpe. Wiley was smaller and was known as Little Harpe. They dropped the name Harper and shortened it to Harpe, reportedly to obscure their past. The first documented killing of their American frontier spree came in 1797, when a man who had accused them of stealing livestock was found dead in the Tennessee River. His chest cavity had been cut open, his organs removed, and the hollow filled with stones so the body would not surface. That image, the gutted torso, weighted and sunk, became what investigators and frontier settlers would come to recognize as the Harpe signature. It was not just murder. It was something deliberate, something that required time and effort after the killing was already done, something that said the act itself was not enough. They were run out of Knoxville and moved on to the Wilderness Road, the main overland route connecting the eastern settlements to the interior, and began working their way through it like a trap. Travelers were robbed and killed. Isolated settlers were murdered in their homes after accepting the Harpes as guests and feeding them. A young Methodist preacher named William Lambuth was stopped on the road by Maikaja, who materialized in front of his horse and demanded he dismount. Lambuth managed to talk his way free, which made him one of the very few people who encountered the Harpes on that road and survived the meeting. Most did not. Bodies were found in rivers, in caves, at the edges of trails, some weighted with stones, some with their skulls crushed, some burned. The methods varied, but the absence of remorse was constant. What made the Harpes genuinely distinct from the violent criminality of the frontier era, and the frontier was genuinely violent, was precisely this absence of conventional motive. Historians at Yukon noted that they did not kill for money or possessions. Frontiersmen who robbed and killed for gain were a known category. The Harpes did not fit it. They turned down opportunities to take valuable items. They murdered people who posed no threat and had nothing worth taking. One of the most documented and disturbing details of the entire case is that Maikaja killed one of his own infant daughters, his own child, in a fit of rage because she would not stop crying. When he was finally captured and dying of his wounds years later, it was the only murder he expressed any regret over. That capture came in August 1799. A posse had been tracking the brothers for months across Kentucky after a series of particularly brutal home invasions. The group caught up with Maikaja near the Red River in Logan County. He was shot from his horse and surrounded. Among the men in that posse was Moses Stigall, whose wife and infant child the Harpes had murdered days earlier. While Maikaja was still alive and conscious, Stigall sawed off his head with a knife. It took time. According to accounts of those present, Maikaja provided directions on how to do it more efficiently. His head was mounted on a pole at a crossroads in Kentucky that locals called Harp's Head Road, a name the area retained for generations. Wiley escaped. He disappeared into the network of river pirates operating along the Ohio and Mississippi, eventually joining the Mason gang under Samuel Mason, a notorious outlaw of the Natchez Trace. He operated under an assumed name for 4 years. Then, in 1803, gang leader Samuel Mason was shot, and Wiley made what turned out to be the last terrible decision of his life. He attempted to claim the reward that had been posted for Mason's capture by bringing Mason's severed head to authorities as proof. The moment he presented it, he was recognized. Wiley Harpe, Little Harpe, the last surviving member of the most feared pair of killers the early American frontier had ever produced, was arrested on the spot. On February 8, 1804, Wiley Harpe was hanged in Old Greenville in the Mississippi Territory. After his execution, his body was taken down and decapitated, his head mounted on a pole along the Natchez Trace as a warning to anyone who traveled that road. He was, at most, in his mid-30s. Between them, historians estimate the Harpes killed somewhere between 30 and 40 confirmed victims, though some accounts place the number considerably higher. The precise count has never been established because the frontier had no reliable system for recording disappearances, and an unknown number of the bodies they left behind were simply never found. What the record does confirm is that they murdered across at least 4 states over 7 years, that no category of person was safe from them, and that their only consistent motivation appeared to be the act of killing itself. They were the first serial killers recorded. And more than 200 years later, criminologists still reach for them as the starting point when they try to explain what an American serial killer is, because Maikaja and Wiley Harpe were doing it before anyone had words for what they were. If you enjoyed this video, tell me in the comments which brother's case was the most disturbing to you. And if you want more in-depth documentaries like this one, like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next rabbit hole.